About 16 years ago, when I was still keeper of the documentary film collections at what was then the National Film and Television Archive, and it was still the 20th century, I worked on drafting a policy document for the public film archive sector. And I think it's important to understand, and I should have said perhaps at the beginning, that what I'm going to talk about this morning is the public film archive sector, which is a fairly narrow but important part of the collections that are available for research in the UK. And also what I should have said at the beginning is that what I'm going to say is my own views, and I'm not representing anybody else this morning. But the document that I was helping to draft at that point was published in the end by the Film Archive Forum under the title Moving History. And the document set out 10 principles which at the time the public archive sector as a whole, national and regional, felt underpinned the basis of a policy for the public sector moving image archives in the UK. Now, I mention this because in that document there's a general statement addressing the question of why we do what we do. And that general statement, which we stuck up front in that document, read, "Archives are the bequest," rather pompously, I think, actually reading it back now, "Archives are the bequest of one nation to the next. A society's provision for its archives is a measure of its civilization. No society can develop and plan for the future without reflecting on the past and understanding the present. Archives provide raw material for such reflection." It's pretty obvious stuff, I think, and I think rather, on reflection, paints rather a bleak view of our current level of civilization, if that's really what archives are. But one of the things that I wanted to start by questioning was, has the change, having been asked to talk about regional archives in the 21st century, I mean, has something changed from the 20th century when these things were established? And is that still a kind of sensible underpinning? And fundamentally, I feel that it really hasn't changed at all. I still firmly believe that underpinning the work that we do is just that. And something else that I don't think the advancing century has or should change is the principal role of the regional moving image archive in its contribution to the nation's ability to reflect by collecting and preserving material which relates to our understanding of the history and culture of region. And I think this is a really important thing to understand, and one of the things that I think perhaps is not clear and we don't articulate well enough. And that is that the collecting policies of the various moving image archives in the public sector across the country and the way that they're interpreted by those organisations clearly drive what comes into the archives, and so understanding the complementarity of those policies across the nations and regions is really crucial to understanding what there is in the collections and why it's kept in that particular collection and not in that one. And in consequence, what we are going to be able to find now and into the future. The BFI National Archive is concerned, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but the last time I looked, it was concerned with the art, history, and impact of the medium. That's the definition as it is now. And the archives in the nations and regions outside of the BFI are more concerned about the people, culture, and history of place. Now, the two things are, of course, far from mutually exclusive, and we are at the Media Archive for Central England, of course, as interested in the medium we collect and its art and history and impact as the BFI are interested in the wider history of the UK. It would be absurd to suggest that anything was otherwise. But they are fundamentally different starting points. It's like looking down two ends of the telescope, if you like. And clearly that significantly impacts our collecting cultures and priorities. At MACE, our interpretation of our responsibility in collecting material which informs our understanding of the Midlands, East and West, is very broadly based. and not all the regional film archives will interpret their remit in quite the same way, I suspect. For us, our potential interest is in any material which informs that understanding of how the region is, including, for example, a film record of how its people spend their leisure time. So I'm not necessarily going to turn around and say to somebody, you have a collection of home movies which you're offering me, you live in Leamington Spa, well, that's terrific. I'll take the ones which show pictures of Leamington Spa or of your journeys around the Midlands. I'm actually just as interested in the fact that they went abroad to Greece or to Italy in the 60s and 70s and shot film there, because that is informing something about the culture of leisure time and holidays for people in the Midlands at that time. And I think that kind of broad-based approach is really important. Today's conference is about television, but I don't think I would, in the context of a regional collection, necessarily want to single that out and talk about it as something separate, though clearly it can be looked at in that kind of way, and you can look at the television collections that we have from a perspective of television. But I've digressed from my text already, and I always get lost. So bear with me while I work my way back. From MACE's perspective, regional television is hugely important, not least because it forms. We hold the regional material of ATV and Central Television in our collections. It is the biggest single part of our collection. It constitutes about a third of what we're holding at the moment. It is probably the most active part of our collection. It's probably partly because it's better catalogued and better available online because of various funding bids that we've had over the years, and there's more of it visible to visitors to us online than other parts of the collection. But actually, it's a hugely important cultural artifact from the perspective of the Midlands, from almost any perspective that you want to look at it. But whether television or not, if we're collecting material to inform understanding of region, then its accessibility is something which is paramount. And I think maybe in the long period that I've worked in the film archives, it's the level of and importance of the accessibility of material and the way that it's the balance of the way that the collections have looked at the material in that way, whether it's preservation that's important or whether it's access that's important. It's the change in that balance, I think, that's the biggest change that's happened. And it's a change that has been driven, I think, both by a shift in expectation, and certainly there's a much greater expectation of accessibility these days than there ever was when I started at the BFI in the 70s, where I don't think there was any expectation of accessibility. And the way that we talked about the collections was that we were preserving them for posterity, and nobody ever talked about when posterity might begin. And, arguably posterity started sometime in the 80s, but, there are still people, I think, who think that for the archives, they're still waiting for posterity to begin. But it has changed hugely, and it's been partly that shift in expectation, and it's been partly driven by the endlessly developing technologies which have enabled access in a variety of different ways. And it would probably be fair to say that not every archivist fully embraces the opportunity to increase accessibility that the changing world presents. But actually, there's now no comparison to the way things were 35 years ago, when the competing and conflicting demands of access and preservation to roles of film were perhaps one of the central debates that were live in the sector. I think there are more fundamental changes that need to be considered and discussed now, though, and rather than that debate about whether it's more important to access or preserve. And one area of debate that's beginning to develop some purchase is what it means to be a preserver and exhibitor of analog materials in a digital age. Perhaps a more live debate among collections of national cinema than it is amongst curators of television or curators in the region. But I think there's no getting away from the fact that a digital copy of an analog artifact seen on some of the many platforms that are available today is not the same thing as seeing the original analog artifact in the way that it was originally seen. And at one level, one might argue that the responsibility of the archivist to the original is as relevant to TV or small gauge collections as it is to cinema, and therefore that debate perhaps ought to be coming down from the collections of national cinema. But it's probably fair to recognise too that today's audiences are, for the most part, more concerned with seeing the content at all than they are with seeing it in its original format. And the idea of reducing film collections to mere content is, for me, I think, a really depressing diminution of form, and is perhaps the most provocative thing that's done to film collections and television collections these days, is to simply talk about it as content. Anyway, that's an aside, really. More important as that debate is, I think more challenging for us as the 21st century progresses is how we recognise and respond to the changing relationship between the archive and the user. And the changes in that relationship, like the changes in the level of accessibility that I've just referred to, while being driven in part by technological development, are also subject to other pressures. And one of the main pressures these days comes from the way that the archives are financially supported. It goes without saying that we could use more money. Every cultural organisation is in that place, and every cultural organisation would say the same thing. But that shortage is having a significant impact, I think, in at least one quite interesting way. As central funding diminishes, so we perforce have to charge more, or charge at all, for the services that we offer. Depressing for somebody who was brought up in a world of public service and still clings with his last fingernails to the idea of public service, because that's what drove me into this world in the first place when I finished my degree, was the idea that I was going to be doing something useful for people generally. And I don't think actually that I'm doing anything less useful now than I ever did. I've had to find a way to rationalize this, and it's quite interesting, you see, to me, that the fact is that the world we live in has changed, and the fact is that these days the political dogma is that the tax base must endlessly be reduced, and that the consumer should pay for things at the point of consumption rather than pay into a larger tax pot and have things provided either free or heavily subsidized by the state. We can see that as the user of archives increasingly becomes a customer of the archive, so the balance of responsibility for the kind of service that we provide is going to change. And the archives have traditionally provided a service which is designed by the archivist for the benefit of the material itself and governed by standards which have been developed over the history of archiving activity for film going back to the mid-1930s. The needs of or desires of the user have kind of played second fiddle to the needs of the material. And up to a point, that's still the case. And as long as the state was paying for the service, that was always likely to be the way that the balance was perceived. But the user has now become the customer and has more power to influence the nature of the service. And it seems to me this can either happen passively, passive because the archive must supply the service the consumer wants, or else it won't be able to develop sufficient income to run itself and look after the material in the first place. Or more actively, the consumer might be in a position to ask for changes in the way that the service is organized. This changing financial balance has become or is becoming a potential driver for what could be seen actually as a positive change. And I should be clear here that I'm not suggesting for a minute that this change of balance should in any way undermine the primacy of master material or the fundamentals of the film archive as preservation organizations, because everything that we do must be built on a firm foundation of that. But actually, in the 21st century, and with a huge armory of new technology opening up all sorts of possibilities, we archivists should be recognizing that this is an appropriate moment to look again at the practice that we've developed over the years. Are the ways that we do things still fit for purpose? And actually, how long is it since we took a long, hard look at how we understand what that purpose is? How long is it since we sat down and thought about all of our potential users now and in the future, and thought about the way that we can, and thought about how the way we conduct our business as archivists impacts its effectiveness as people who provide an opportunity to users? As an example of what I mean, I just want to look very quickly at cataloguing as one area of our working practice. Now, for some years, I've mused on the question of whether the ways in which we arrange our collections and present them are really adequate or appropriate. The way we catalogue and present material is according to principles of library cataloguing developed in a pre-computer era and subsequently adapted for use in the film archives, and subsequently then again they've been broadened and adapted for use within a computerized age. And this approach is fine up to a point, and it's fine for those who are used to using library systems and whose mind works like librarians or archivists, God help them. The standardized approaches to cataloguing which are recognized across collections are clearly crucial to facilitate the sharing of data between collections. I mean, clearly, it's more and more important that we manage to have some kind of interoperability, and having metadata standards is fundamental to being able to achieve that kind of interoperability and the bringing together of composite catalogues which enable more comprehensive research strategies. And that's, I think, becoming increasingly important, and where we've got to be looking is how we begin to develop ways of making connections outside the film archive collection. So somebody who's researching a topic can begin to find things which aren't just about film and then have to go and look for something somewhere else, but how we begin to bring different kinds of information together. Now, that convergence can only happen if we have some standardized metadata approaches. But I think we need to recognize that just because we're information professionals, we don't have a monopoly of understanding of the material that we're looking after. Not everybody thinks like us, not everybody thinks about the material like we do. So shouldn't we be looking to extend the kinds of metadata relating to the material that we're holding? It's true that IT developments, things like free text searching, have made finding material more flexible than it was in the days when you would have had to have thumbed your way through drawers of cards. But still, the metadata that is created around the collections is still based on the archivist's viewing, on our description of the material, on our understanding of what that material, and ultimately on a set of rules which we have to adhere to. And our interpretation of those rules and the way we apply them and the style that we adopt in that application is, of course, influenced by our institutional responsibility towards the collection of material that we have. And in our case at MACE, the context into which we will put the film when we catalogue it derives from our responsibility to reflect some aspect of region. But it seems to me that that's going to present quite a narrow opportunity, or it's going to present a narrower opportunity to somebody searching than we need to, or perhaps should be thinking about offering now. Should we be satisfied that we're doing the job of making the stuff as broadly accessible as well as we can, if that's what we do? Are we really only the custodians of material to be looked at in this one context? This material, it seems to me, can be approached from many perspectives, many contexts. It can be understood from as many contexts as there are people who want to come and look at it. Everybody will bring their understanding to the material that they're looking at. And its potential level of interest will depend on the context in which it's being seen. The starting point for accessibility is that users can locate something which is going to be of interest to them. It seems to me at the moment users will find something only if they're coming at it from the same place, or broadly the same place, as we are describing it. But our material might well be of interest from a whole series of other perspectives and for a whole series of other reasons which our descriptions of the material simply don't capture or reflect. And if they're not captured or reflected, then people interested in those aspects that our films may offer to them will probably never find them. In the 21st century, therefore, with techniques of online feedback and sharing of information well advanced, I'm beginning to think that we as archivists should be thinking about how to crowdsource responses, crowdsource other perspectives, crowdsource emotions. Thank you, Steve. I'm on the last page nearly. Crowdsource other responses and present a whole series of broader other responses for people to better connect with the material. This approach seems to me to be just as important to the academic as it is to the general audience, and just as important for TV as it is for any other kind of moving image document. And the things that define the regional collections are the decisions about what come in. And whilst they may be open to some change of interpretation, the fundamentals of what drives what we collect will remain allied to ideas about region. And it's a problem for us that we are handing on to future generations at the moment a kind of gap, because we have good methods for finding, acquiring, selecting analog materials which exist tangibly. The material which is being produced now doesn't exist in any kind of tangible form, and and archives are carrion organizations in a dreadful sort of way, and things come to us when people die, and people find things and think, this is interesting, I shall give them to somebody, but they're not going to find things if they're sitting in a hard drive along with lots of other things. These are big issues that we've got, but I think fundamentally I'm interested at the moment in trying to develop new ways of contextualizing and presenting material, because ultimately I don't think it's entirely our responsibility to present what we have and to curate what we have. It's partly, I think it's right that we should do some of that, but actually I want to see a much greater and broader impact, and that's the way I want to see the archives move in the 21st century. So that's what I have to say.